Now, the talk tonight is a story with a moral, and it's about Roundup, the well-known herbicide, and how weeds have become, or are becoming, resistant to it. Now, I suppose if you took a survey of and asked people in general to name a herbicide, almost everybody would have heard of Roundup. It's the best known herbicide in the world. And it's manufactured by, you know who manufactures it? Monsanto, yeah, a huge international corporation. And they did a very clever thing with Roundup. And then they decided to challenge evolution with this new technology. And it's not working out so good, because evolution is the most powerful biological mechanism on Earth. And what Monsanto tried to do with their new technology that involved Roundup was to outrun evolution on a bicycle. And they even didn't have the tires on the bicycle well pumped up. So they've run into problems. Now, a little summary of the lecture before I give it to you. Will I turn down the lights more, or are they okay? Crops, to get a good yield of crop production to feed the numbers of people who are in the world today, we are dependent on scientific agriculture and on fertilizers and herbicides. Now, herbicides are chemicals that kill weeds, but the weeds can fight back by developing resistance to the herbicides. This is a natural mechanism, an evolutionary mechanism, and that will inevitably happen. Whether it happens to a big extent or small extent depends on how clever you are in your technology. Now, Roundup is the best known herbicide in the world. The active agent, the agent in Roundup that kills the weed, is a chemical called glyphosate. And Roundup is a critically important herbicide in worldwide agriculture. But the weeds that Roundup kills in agriculture are now becoming resistant to glyphosate. In other words, glyphosate can't kill them so easily or kill them at all. Some of them. Therefore, new strategies will have to be developed to protect the crops from these weeds. Now, there is a crop that is heavily infested with weeds, and the problem, a weed after all is only a plant that is in the wrong place. There's nothing wrong with the weed as a plant. It's just that it's not economically productive for you, and it competes with the crop that you're trying to grow. And it will cut down on the yield of the crop, and you'll make less money, and you'll produce less food. So that's why it's important to control weeds in agriculture. So here in this slide, I'm just saying again that the problem that weeds pose in agriculture is they rob the useful plant of water, because they take up their own water, nutrients, they are plants, just that the crop is a plant, and also sunlight. They can shade the plants from sunlight. And some weeds are extremely powerful competitors with the crop plant. For example, a giant ragweed, it's not a weed that would be common here, but it's very common in America. If you have one of these giant ragweeds in an area that holds 30 soya plants, that one weed can reduce the yield of the soya by 50%. So if you're going to get a good yield out of your soya crop, you need to do something about the weeds, otherwise the weeds will take over. Now, traditionally the way that weeds were controlled was by tillage. That means ploughing and hoeing. And you would plough up the soil, that would root up any weeds that were growing and also bury their seeds. Labour intensive and energy intensive if you use a tractor to do it. That was the traditional method going back to the dawn of agriculture. After World War II, chemical methods were developed. Herbicides, organic herbicides, these are just chemicals, to kill weeds selectively. And glyphosate was discovered in 1970. It's a simple enough chemical. I won't say anything about its structure. And it was patented very quickly by Monsanto and incorporated into a product called Roundup. Now, the active agent in the Roundup is glyphosate, and the other things in the Roundup are just carrier agents that help the glyphosate to penetrate a leaf. You have soapy things in there and some other things in there. And the whole composition of the mixture is patented by Monsanto, but the active agent is the glyphosate. Now, extensive tests have been done on glyphosate to see is it safe. And it is one of the least toxic and persistent of herbicides. Least toxic means that when it's used to challenge animals or humans, it is not very toxic. It doesn't cause cancer, for example. So it's relatively benign compared to a lot of other herbicides. And it's not very persistent. That means that when it gets onto the soil, it doesn't stay there very long. It's broken down and disappears. So it's quite a useful herbicide. But it was awkward to use because it kills everything green. It's a very, we probably all have used Roundup at home. I use it to kill weeds between shrubs in the borders of my estate. And, or you could use it to kill things that would grow in the driveway. It'll kill anything green, but your crop is green, so you can't use it indiscriminately or it'll kill the crop as well. So it was awkward to use when it was developed, and it is awkward still to use amongst shrubs and things, because if you put it on the shrub, it'll kill the shrub. So you've got to go between the shrub. So when it was introduced first, in agriculture, it was awkward to use. It had to be sprayed on the weeds between the useful crop plants. And it was no good putting it down on the soil before you plant it. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't kill emerging weeds. The weed has to be up and green before it will kill it. And as I said, glyphosate is the active agent in Roundup, which was patented by Monsanto in the early 1970s. And Roundup is now widely used in a technology developed by Monsanto called genetic modification. And I'll describe this in a minute. Monsanto have developed artificially, they have genetically modified the major commodity crops to become resistant to Roundup. So Roundup kills everything green, and it would kill a normal green crop plant. But these plants have been genetically modified to become resistant to Roundup. So you can see this is a very clever idea, because you now plant your corn or whatever that is resistant to Roundup, just plant it, let the weeds grow, let the plants grow, and then come along and spray Roundup over everything, and the Roundup now only kills the weeds. It doesn't kill the useful plant, crop plant. So that's very clever. And Roundup is the best selling. It's widely used, of course, with these Roundup resistant crops that have been developed by Monsanto. And it's the best selling herbicide in the world. Now, glyphosate is not the only herbicide by any manner or means. Other ones were developed. One of the earliest was called 2,4-D, and that was the first of a class of herbicides that mimic a plant hormone called auxin. And it sends the weeds, or the plant that it hits, into a frenzy of growth, and the plant just goes wild and grows itself, the weed grows itself to death. But these herbicides are not as widely used at all as the Roundup is in agriculture worldwide. So that's the traditional method of controlling weeds, and we were all familiar with it as youngsters out the country, the farmer ploughing. So you break up the soil, root up any weeds that are there, turn the soil over, bury the seeds, and you do that. It's labour intensive. It also breaks up the soil structure and leads to soil erosion and also runoff of nutrients and chemicals from the soil into the local waterways. So it's the traditional method, but there are problems associated with it. It's labour intensive also, and will use up a lot of diesel in your tractor if you pull the plough with a tractor, which is what would be done nowadays. You wouldn't have the horse to pull the plough. Now, glyphosate is the active agent in Roundup. So how does it work? Well, it works as follows. The plant, like anything living, anything biological, is made up of cells, and one of the things that are in the cells that are essential to the cell are proteins. Proteins are the most important things in cells. And proteins are made from units called amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acid. And each of these amino acids has to be either supplied to the plant or made by the plant in order to make the proteins. And glyphosate inhibits an enzyme which is mercifully abbreviated to EPSPS, because that stands for 5-enol pyruvyl shikimate 3-phosphate synthase. So I wouldn't want to be saying that all night. So that enzyme, EPSPS, that is necessary in the cell for the synthesis of 3 essential amino acids in plants. And these are, if any of you know anything about amino acids, these are the aromatic amino acids. And that enzyme is necessary for these to be synthesized in the plants. And all proteins require the aromatic amino acids to work. So if you block the enzyme that synthesizes these aromatic amino acids, you will kill the plant, because the plant won't be able to make protein, and protein is absolutely essential. That's the way glyphosate works. It shuts down protein synthesis. Now, this is the trick that Monsanto did, which was very clever and took an awful long time and a ferocious investment of money. That enzyme, EPSPS, in the cell is controlled by a gene. All enzyme production is controlled by genes, and every enzyme, and there are thousands of them in the cell, every enzyme is controlled by its own gene. Now, a mutant gene, that means a changed gene for EPSPS, that is not inhibited by glyphosate. Your normal EPSPS is inhibited by glyphosate, but there is a mutant gene in a bacterium that's not inhibited by EPSPS, and Monsanto found that gene after many, many years. And they took it out of the bacterium and they inserted it into the major cash crops. These are soya, cotton, corn, and canola, to make them resistant to Roundup. So they put that gene into these crops. The normal gene in these crops is inhibited by Roundup. They put this gene in, and it is not inhibited by Roundup. So these crops now are Roundup resistant. And they did this work in 1996. They did it first, I think, in soya, and then quickly they put it into corn and cotton. By 1998, they had the major cash crops all Roundup resistant. They could produce Roundup resistant seeds. And weed control now became very easy, because you just plant your crop with the Roundup resistant seed, let it emerge from the soil, grow, and then as soon as the weeds start to come up, you just spray everything with Roundup. If more come up later, spray again. If more come up later, spray again. Very easy. No need for tillage, or very little need for tillage. No need for any other herbicide. Much reduced need for tillage, as I said. And in America now, almost all the soya and most corn and cotton is Roundup ready. It took Monsanto, when they added it up, 700,000 man-years or person-years. That was the effort they had to put in to develop this technology. They spent about 10 years at it, and they invested, without any return, an awful lot of money in that. So when they got the technology working, they were gagging to get a return on their money. And this is part of the problem that arose. And Monsanto is heavily dependent on Roundup products, on selling Roundup itself and on selling these Roundup resistant or Roundup ready seeds. And half of their annual sales are accounted for by Roundup technology. These are the main plants: cotton, corn, and soy. So the technology was invented about 1996, and it took off in certain parts of the world, big time. So if you look at the industrial world here, these are million hectares, I think, on this axis here that are planted with these genetically modified crops. Million hectares, yeah. 1996 to 2007. And you see, it took off fairly quickly. And where the green are the parts of the world where these crops are planted. So we have North America, Canada and the USA, and in South America, mainly Brazil and Argentina. China, in the rest of the world, Australia. But apart from that, very little. Now, we don't, even though there's a fair bit of green here in Europe, very little genetically modified crop is planted in Europe. And that way exaggerates it there. So it's mostly North America and South America and Australia and China. Now this graph ends 2007. These lines here have gone up since. So it's a successful technology, even if not worldwide. Europe has been very resistant to introducing genetic modified crops because of scares about these crops affecting the environment and also affecting health. That's just another slide showing the worldwide distribution of genetically modified crops. Now in Europe, there's a little bit of genetic modified crops grown in Spain, tomato I think, and in Germany, potato. But they're not for human consumption, as far as I know. I didn't look up any more on that, but there's not much happening in Europe. Europe is very resistant, but not America, North and South America. So the weeds becoming resistant to Roundup. Natural selection, which I'll describe in a minute, it's the mechanism through which evolution works, has allowed many weeds to develop resistance to Roundup. And at least 10 weed species in America and 10 in the rest of the world have developed resistance to Roundup. Now Monsanto will point out that is only 10 out of about 300 relevant weed species. But unfortunately, these 10 include some of the most rapacious and persistent of the weeds. They're not Mickey Mouse weeds that have become resistant. They're serious players. And they include ragweed, giant ragweed, horseweed, Johnson grass, water hemp, and pigweed. They're some of the most prolific and intractable. Pigweed, giant pigweed, is a ferocious thing. It will grow a stem as thick as a baseball bat, and even one of these giant weeds can disable a combine harvester. So It's a serious business. About 10 million acres of land in America, in the USA, now has Roundup resistant weeds. Now that's only 10 out of 400 million acres, but this is growing year on year, and at least one new weed species a year is becoming resistant. Overall, at least 195 weeds have developed resistance to 19 different herbicides, but because of the technology that is operating now, with the Roundup ready seeds worldwide, the biggest problem is resistance to Roundup, because these Roundup ready seeds have a corner on the market worldwide. It's very difficult to control the weeds that have become resistant to Roundup. That there is showing you a giant ragweed, and you can see how big these weeds can get when out of control compared to the size of the woman there holding it. And so these weeds are serious customers. They're resorting again to traditional methods in America, in places where this resistance is bad, Roundup resistance. They send in teams with hoes to just hack out, or try to hack out these weeds. The herbicide won't do it. So it's either write the crop off or send in teams of men to do this traditional form of weeding from thousands of years ago. Now, the reason, the mechanism by which the weeds have developed resistance is through natural selection. And natural selection is the mechanism of biological evolution. Biological evolution is the most powerful biological mechanism in the world. It allowed the life to evolve from a very simple single form that arose on Earth about 3.8 billion years ago, barely distinguishable from slime. It allowed that very simple form to develop, as here, along various lines up to the present day. It allowed the gradual emergence of innumerable species of life, 99% of which subsequently died out and new species replaced them. It allowed this radiating development along different pathways to develop, giving us the various forms of plant and animal life that now populate the Earth, including humans. For some strange reason, this diagram doesn't include a human, but there should be a human down there. So this mechanism has developed relentlessly. It's extremely powerful, the most powerful thing known, and it has produced not only this myriad flowering of life, a diversity of life, but it has produced conscious life. It has produced self-conscious life. So from the beginning, and even back here, where we have just inanimate molecules, natural selection has allowed slime or muck to live, first of all, then to get up and walk, and to talk, and to us here tonight. So that is what natural selection can do. And this is what Monsanto was challenging with its new technology. Now, of course, all agriculture, all cultivation of crops has to fight natural selection. It's not just Monsanto. And they did it using traditional methods. But Monsanto developed this very, very smart technology. And I mean, to give them their due, it was very smart. It took a long time to develop it. They made the crops resistant. It was very clever. If it could work reliably, it would be a very, very good idea. But it has to take on this mechanism here, natural selection, because the weeds have this ability, through natural selection, to fight anything that challenges them. And the problem with the new technology was it tried to move too fast and too lazily to combat the power of natural selection. The traditional methods combat natural selection as well, but they come to a sort of a truce with it. And you have to tolerate a certain amount of weeds and pests and disease in your crops. And you have a bad season and a good season, and gradually things get better, and through traditional methods of improving your crops, you gradually get better. But it's slow and painful, and it works, but it doesn't work that brilliantly, and it takes a long time. The new technology promised to revolutionize things, but as we will see, it didn't. Now, this slide here is to illustrate natural selection in a bacterium. And many bacteria they cause disease. And antibiotics were developed to kill harmful bacteria. There are chemicals that interfere with the growth and the well-being of bacteria, antibiotics. So you see there in the top of the slide you have a selection of bacteria, and they're coloured 3 different colours: light yellow, darker yellow and red. And that means that this is to code their resistance to the antibiotic that you're going to use to control them. You're going to just use one antibiotic. Some of the bacteria have only a low resistance to they're very susceptible to being killed by the antibiotic. Others have a medium level of resistance, and the red ones have a high resistance to the antibiotic. Now you find this sort of variation in all biological populations. With us here in the room, there's natural variation. All the men are not identical and all the women are not identical, obviously. But apart from the surface appearance, there's all sorts of other variations. Some people are susceptible to getting colds, others aren't. Some people can run fast, others can't. There's all sorts of variation. And a lot of the properties we have that underlie this variation are genetically controlled. So if you have a population of animals, and some of the animals can run very fast and others are a bit sluggish, and these animals are preyed upon by a predator, and the predator is stronger than them, and if a predator can catch one of the animals, it will kill and eat it. And obviously, the animals that can't run as fast as others will be culled a lot more efficiently by the predator than the animals that can run very fast. Now, the ability to run would be controlled not by a single gene, but by several genes, but it would be under genetic control. So, you start out with a population of animals and they're being preyed upon. The predators will cull the slower running animals. So you end up with a population of animals then that is enriched in the faster running animals. And they breed and they pass on their properties to their children, their progeny. So the next generation is now significantly enriched in animals that can run faster. And the slower moving of them, again, will be culled in the second generation by the predator. So the faster moving animals will be able to procreate better because they survive. You can't procreate if you're dead. And they will further enhance in the second generation the property of running fast. And what's happening here is natural selection. Nature is selecting for animals that have a property that allows them to breed more successfully than their companions. That's natural selection. It's a very simple mechanism that was discovered by Charles Darwin. and co-discovered by Alfred Russel Wallace, whom nobody hears about. But the two of them came up with that idea. You only hear about Darwin, you don't hear about Wallace. Darwin was a member of the Ascendancy, and he also wrote famous books. Wallace didn't. So Darwin's name is the one that survives. Wallace wasn't that popular with the powers that be at the time either, because he wanted to exempt from the evolutionary scheme. He wanted to exempt humans, because he didn't think that self-consciousness arose through natural selection. And he also believed in spiritualism, and this did not go down well. But he was the co-originator of natural selection. He may have had the idea before Darwin, for all we know. But you don't hear much about it. So that is natural selection, a very simple idea, and nature selecting those members that are able to breed better than their companions. And their properties are automatically enhanced in the next generation because the properties are genetically controlled. So here you have natural variation here in this population, and you'll always have this. You will never have identical organisms, or hardly ever. You hit this with the antibiotic, and what happens is, of course, the single antibiotic will kill off the more susceptible ones, but will leave some of the more resistant ones, and you end up with a population that's highly enriched in the high resistance bacteria. So now what you've done by using just a single antibiotic, and maybe we're not using it very well, is you've changed that population into that. So now you get sick again, and you take more antibiotic. And now you're challenging that, which is all high resistance, and the antibiotic no longer. You've become resistant to the antibiotic. And this is what has happened in modern medicine. The over-prescription of antibiotics has bred bacteria through natural selection that are resistant to the antibiotic. So the indiscriminate use of antibiotic has done that. Now how do you get around this? Well, you can develop new antibiotics. Or a better thing is, instead of hitting that population with a single antibiotic, you hit it with 3 or 4 different antibiotics. Because these boys here that are resistant to that antibiotic won't be as resistant to, if you use 3 or 4, 1 or more of the other 2 or 3. So what you do then is you try to kill them all so that none survive. And then you're successful. And that's the way they deal with AIDS now. Antibiotics to deal with AIDS would be multi-targeted because AIDS, the AIDS virus changes and mutates very quickly. So you have to hit it with several antibiotics. And this was what didn't happen with the Monsanto technology. They used Roundup the whole time on the same crop, year in, year out. And this was a natural laboratory for forcing natural selection to select weeds that were highly resistant to Roundup. So the major way in which the resistance came about to Roundup was not that the weeds, it was thought initially that what was happening when the Roundup resistant weeds began to emerge, it was thought that what's happening here is the gene that was inserted in the crop for Roundup resistance jumped into the weed. See, theoretically that could happen. But that is not what happened. And in fact, on reflection, the weeds, the Native American weeds, are not at all closely related to the crops that came from Europe. The corn and the soy and the canola and the cotton. They're not closely related to them enough to significantly interbreed. And you need to get interbreeding if you're going to get genes to jump from one species to another. So it wasn't jumping of the resistant gene from the crop to the weed that happened. But what happened was the weeds amplified the genes for making the enzyme EPSPS. So in the susceptible plant, you have only the normal number of genes that are coding for this enzyme. So there's the enzyme that is made by this gene here, and the herbicide mops it all up, inhibits all the enzyme, and the plant dies. But the weed that has become resistant has amplified the number of genes that code for normal EPSPS. So you see they're all over the place here. And they make so much of the enzyme, the normal enzyme, that they swamp the ability of the herbicide, the glyphosate, to control them. Right? It's like sending, in a battle, 2 soldiers out. If you send 2 soldiers out to fight 2 enemy soldiers, there's a good chance that they will prevail. Certainly if you send 10 out to fight 2, they will prevail. And that's what was happening here. But if you send 10 soldiers out to fight 100 enemies, the 100 is going to win. And that's what's happening here. They make so much of the normal enzyme, the resistant weeds, that they swamp the capacity of the herbicide to inhibit them. Now that's what happened. And natural selection allowed that to develop. And these weeds here that have developed the resistance make up to 160 times more of the normal enzyme than here. So the herbicide, no matter how much of it you put on, is not able to handle all of the normal enzyme that's made. Now, the technology was only introduced in about, properly in about the year 2000. So we're now 2012. So it's taken about 10 years for this to happen. And it was not at all predicted that this would happen so quickly. I mean, everybody knew that weeds would eventually start to develop resistance to any herbicide. This is a natural phenomenon. But this wasn't supposed to happen for 40 years, you know. But it happened within 10 years. So why was this? It was because of the sort of lazy way the technology was applied. The thing worked so well, and the farmers were delighted with it, that they used only Roundup. They bought Roundup-resistant seeds, and they used only Roundup as the herbicide to kill the weeds. They didn't alternate with another herbicide. What they should have done was use Roundup predominantly, but alternate with maybe 2 other herbicides. Like in the case of the antibiotics. Instead of using just one antibiotic, use a number. Because it's highly unlikely that a weed will spontaneously become resistant to 3 different herbicides in a quick time. So they didn't do that because it was so convenient. They just used Roundup year in, year out on the same crop. And Monsanto, I understand, I can't be absolutely sure of this, didn't encourage the use of other herbicides. It wanted payback on its investment, naturally. Now Monsanto now does encourage the use of other herbicides, and it says that it always did, but did it? And also, resistance wouldn't have developed so quickly. Well, the last point is repeating the top one. If you use 1 or more herbicides in addition to Roundup, and also if you use a technique called crop rotation. Now, does anybody here in agriculture understand what crop rotation is? Yeah. It means when you're growing a crop in a field, it's a traditional method for controlling weeds. You're growing a crop in a field and you have to control the weeds. So you might grow it 2 seasons, but then it's good practice to grow something else in that field for another season or 2, and then maybe grow something else, and then come back to your original crop again. Because this keeps the weeds guessing. Weeds thrive on unchanged conditions. That's what they want. They want time for natural, well, I'm just using sort of human language here, because the weed doesn't want anything, but if it did, it wants time for natural selection to allow it to develop resistance to whatever method you're using to control it. And if you keep challenging it with the same resistance every year, using the same technique, the same approach, it will figure out quickly, more quickly than if you use different approaches every year for several years and then come back to the first one. You keep it guessing. If you don't keep it guessing, it much more quickly develops a resistance. And crop rotation is a good way to keep it guessing in a simple way. And organic farmers who don't use any chemicals or try not to use any chemicals are heavily dependent. They have to control weeds as well, but they are heavily dependent and expert at how to rotate crops. So what should have been done here is, this new technology was sort of magic. It did work extremely well, but not just become entirely dependent on it. They should have used some traditional hoeing and tillage anyway. They should have used herbicides in addition to Roundup, and they should have rotated crops. And if they had done that, we'd maybe only have one weed now that was resistant to Roundup instead of 12 or 14 at the moment. And you'd get a lot more life out of the new technology that was developed. Now, the new strategy that's being developed in the light of the Roundup resistance that is developed, the new strategy is to genetically engineer crops that are resistant to 2 or more herbicides. So the crops that are there now are Roundup resistant corn, say. So they're genetically engineering them now to be resistant to maybe 3 different herbicides, so that you can rotate. You still have the convenience of just dousing the whole crop with the herbicide, but you use herbicide A for a while, then you use herbicide B, then you use herbicide C. And now the weed has to become resistant to 3 different herbicides before it's resistant. And that's not going to happen quickly. So that's the technique, and they're developing these, and they're stacking these genes into the plants. And they're also advocating crop rotation. Now, there's a bit of a problem here because there's only a limited number of chemical herbicides available. And these are the ones that they're putting in the genes for resistance against. Now, glyphosate is a very good herbicide. It's not very toxic and it's not persistent. But some of the others, like that one there, 2,4-D, and dicamba, these are older herbicides. And they're more persistent in soil, and they also have some health effects. But it's legal to use them because they got approval from the Department of Agriculture years ago. And they're now being, as they say, grandfathered in. But they are not as benign as the glyphosate. Another problem is if you start to stack these genes, these artificial genes, in the crops, you start to weaken the vigor of the crop, of the plant. I mean, the plant is naturally designed to do a job, and it's naturally supplied with its genetic complement. If you start putting in other genes into it, it finds it harder and harder. It's like adding more devices into your car engine. The engine is designed to run optimally as it was built, but if you start putting in all sorts of more gimmicks into it, it will start to labour after a while. So you can't put in too many of these genes into a plant, and we don't know how much the vigour will be depleted by stacking these characteristics into plants. Now there's another genetic modification trick, again developed largely by Monsanto. Corn in particular is very susceptible to this little insect, or this little mite called the corn borer. It bores into the plant, into the stem and into the root, and kills it quickly. And corn is very susceptible to that. And if that pest, if your crop becomes infected with that pest, it really decimates the crop. Now, in 2003, Monsanto introduced a thing called BT corn. Now, BT corn is genetically modified corn, and it's a genetically modified corn that is resistant to the rootworm. These creatures that bore into the plant and kill it are all types of a rootworm. Now, they found a bacterium. Like in the case of Roundup resistance, they took a gene out of a bacterium and put it into the plant. They did the same here. They found a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, BT for short, that produces a toxin that kills the rootworm. And they took that gene out of the bacterium and they put it into the crops, because the rootworms are very destructive to the crops. And now the crop is expressing this toxin that kills the rootworm. So when the pest comes along and eats the leaf of that crop, it eats the toxin and the toxin kills it. Again, very clever. But because of the same problem, of using the same technique year in, year out on the same crop, the rootworms are now starting to develop resistance to the BT corn. So that technology is running into trouble. And the reason is that the farmers weren't practicing crop rotation and weren't planting enough conventional corn within the BT field. See, you should do that as a precaution. Put in ordinary corn, because the ordinary corn is susceptible to the normal rootworm, and it will feed a population of the rootworms in the crop, and that natural population of the rootworm will keep down the rootworms that have become resistant. They'll compete with them. So it's like crop rotation. It's another mechanism. It is crop rotation. It's just being done at the same time as you plant your BT corn. So they weren't doing that, and they weren't rotating crops. They weren't growing a different crop the next season and a different one the next season and then back to the first one. And the little rootworms are now starting to become resistant to the technology, and it will have a limited life. And most of the crops that I spoke there about that are Roundup resistant are also genetically engineered to be BT crops. So you're starting to put, this technology is starting to put in 5 and 6 genes into these crops, and that is going to cut down on the vigor of the crops. After a while, the crop wouldn't be any good, it just wouldn't grow, because you put in so many genes into it that weren't naturally designed to be there. Now there's a bit of a debate about, some people say that genetically modified crops don't significantly increase food yield. And that would be a big criticism if that were true. And it's true to a certain extent. There was a meta-analysis, and I haven't got the reference there, that's put it in 2010, of many, many studies that were done on genetically modified crop yields. I mean, theoretically, the yield that you get in Roundup-resistant crops should go up significantly over traditional agriculture. But it doesn't go up that much. In developed countries, say in America, the GM crops, the increase in yield from them is only about 6%. It is there, it's small. It's 29% in underdeveloped countries. And that's because the conditions that were being used in underdeveloped countries to begin with were so poor that the new technology had a much bigger effect when it was introduced. So 29%. Tillage was reduced, and tillage has bad effects, as I said early on, by 25 to 58% on herbicide-resistant soybeans, and insecticide application, which is what had to be put onto the crops that were the corn that was susceptible to the European corn borer. You had to protect against it, so they used to spray the actual bacteria that had the gene. They used to spray that bacterium onto the crop and let the bacterium just naturally produce its toxin. And other insecticides as well. But if you have BT crops, you can reduce the insecticide application by up to 76%. And overall, 72% of farmers worldwide reported some positive economic results from the new technology. In other words, they were making a little bit more money. But, you know, considering the risks that we might be taking with these GM crops, the benefits so far seem rather marginal from them. Now, if you don't develop through genetic modification, you use conventional plant breeding. And this slide here just contrasts the two methods. I'm nearly finished now. In conventional breeding, you want to improve the stock. You want to say to make it more drought resistant if the area you're growing the plants in is susceptible to drought, or if the plants are susceptible to a certain disease, you would like to make the plants more resistant to that disease. And in this case here, the example is trying to improve, using conventional plant breeding methods, trying to improve resistance to a disease. So what you do is you take a plant that is known to have a good resistance to the disease, and you cross it with the popular plant that you're growing that isn't as resistant as you would like to the disease. So you cross them, sexually mate one with the other, and the offspring will have some of the resistant characteristics in it. But it will also, the offspring will also inherit all of the other characteristics that the two parents had as well. And some of these characteristics would probably not be desirable characteristics. So you've taken on some good characteristics and maybe several undesirable ones. So what you have to do then is, you haven't advanced very much. You've got to then back cross, that's what BC means, that one there, with, you've got to screen them all, see which are the more resistant ones, and back cross them with one of these or one of these, and keep doing that again and again after many generations until you weed out the undesirable characteristics to a good extent and build up the good characteristics, and here you are eventually with a good few of the resistant genes against the disease, but you also have many other characteristics that maybe are now benign. But it takes many generations. And also, you can only cross closely related plants. They have to be related enough to be able to sexually mate. And so you're talking slow and, slow and not that sure. Whereas here, if you want to put into your crop a gene that will confer resistance through genetic modification, you can slice out just the gene for resistance from another organism, usually it's a bacterium, and put it in one go in here. And the only characteristic that you're transferring is the characteristic for resistance. You're not taking in all the other unwanted characteristics. And you do it in one go, and you don't have to have closely related species. As I say, usually you take the gene out of a bacterium and you put it into a plant. They're not closely related. Whereas here you have to have cousins. So theoretically this is much cleaner and faster. But it's a new technology. Here we're dealing with natural technology the whole time. It's an artificial situation in the sense that you are taking plants that might want to be breeding together and making them breed together, but they're doing it by the natural mechanism. Here you're using technology, because this type of thing doesn't happen in nature, where you take out a single gene, cut it out from one organism and put it into another organism that is wildly different from it. But it does work, as we saw with the Roundup resistance. But then you have to be very careful how you use the new technology. You can't use it in the lazy way that it was used with Roundup resistance. And it was lazy from the point of view of Monsanto and the farmers. The farmers could see the Roundup resistant weeds developing. And they didn't start to crop rotate, and they didn't start to use several different herbicides. They just increased the dosage of the Roundup. So everybody wanted convenience, everybody wanted cheap farming, and Monsanto wanted a quick return on its money, and it's human nature. So on all sides that cause the technology to, that's my last slide now, cause the technology not to have such a long lifespan. So I already told you the approach that's now being used to, for the next generation of genetically modified crops. Instead of just Roundup resistant, they're going to put genes into them that make them resistant to 2 or more additional herbicides. And they're also going to practice this crop rotation and other traditional methods. But there is only a limited number of chemical herbicides. There's glyphosate and there are several other types, but only a limited number because the big corporations stopped developing the different chemical herbicides because it takes a lot of time and money to do it, and they had the idea of genetic modification and they went for that. And they stopped developing the... so there's only a limited number of herbicides available. And now they're genetically modifying the crops to become resistant to a significant number of these. But natural selection will still work against them all, and it will gradually prevail. And if they use the same lazy methods they used in the past, natural selection within the next 10 years will defeat all of the new genetically modified crops with the stacked traits in them. That is the estimate. But we still only have a limited number of... So what if we allow weeds to become resistant to all the herbicides that we have? We'll then have weeds that nothing can control. So we don't want that. So that is a consideration. And then people would wonder as well, has the genetic modification approach worked anyway? Because there are only 2 really useful outcomes from it, even though they haven't worked very well because they sort of were lazy in the way they applied them. But Roundup resistance or glyphosate resistance is one, and the BT corn is the other. They haven't, there are not endless examples of this technology, and it's very expensive, and one would wonder if the traditional breeding methods are not better overall. They're certainly cheaper. Now they're slow and uncertain, but they do work. And I mean, the green revolution that was applied in Asia with great effect, that was conventional breeding methods. So I will end there. I would say that the technology of genetic modification should be pursued. I wouldn't condemn it out of hand, but it must be done with great care and slowly, and traditional methods should be brought along with it.